Chapter 7 of the Three Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Three Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 7. To Save the Flag. I say, Jack, can you tell me what all this row is about between us and these wide-breeched, red-capped niggers? The Egyptians asked Adair as he stood by the side of Jack Roberts on the quarter-deck of the Racer, while the latter, with his spyglass under his arm, was doing duty as signal midshipman. The outlines of many a picturesque hill and white stone stronghold, famed in ancient and modern history, rose in the distance on the Syrian coast out of the blue glittering ocean. "Why," replied Jack, "I'm not much of a politician, Paddy, as far as I can make out. Old Mehemet Ali wants to be the Sultan of the Turks, and we won't let him. And so Charlie Napier told him that if he didn't draw in his horns within 20 days, we would blow his fortresses on this coast about the ears of his pachas. He, in return, told Charlie to go to Jericho, that he intended to keep what he got, and so now we're going to do what we promised. We shall have fun, depend on it." "Now I understand all the ins and outs of the matter," replied Paddy. "There's nothing like knowing what you are fighting about." "There, up goes a signal from the flagship," cried Jack, putting his glass to his eye and pointing it towards the Princess Charlotte, Sir Robert Stopford's flagship, which, with its powerful Thunderer, Benbow, and several other lines of battleships and frigates, sloops and steamers, joined by a Turkish squadron under Admiral Walker and a few Austrian ships, was cruising off Beirut. The signal for the captains of each ship to assemble on board the Princess Charlotte, cried Jack. "Hurrah, the fun is to begin." The captains having visited the flagship, the squadron stood in, the larger portion taking up a position opposite the town, which they forthwith commenced bombarding, while the rest were employed in landing troops at different points to co-operate with the Turks and to distract the attention of the Egyptians. Suleiman Pacha, governor of Beirut, in spite of the shot and shell showered into his fortress, held out bravely and fired away in return as hard as he could. It was the first time the three midshipmen of the Racer had been under fire, but as she had not to take any very active part in the affair, they voted it very slow work. "Is this what you call fighting?" said Jack. "It seems to me as if all the fun was on one side." "Stay a bit, my boy," observed Hemming. "This is only just the beginning of the game. Before many days are over, perhaps we shall be at something which will make you cry out the other way. At all events, we have silenced them. See! Up goes a flag of truce on the old castle," exclaimed Jack. Jack was right in his fact, but wrong in his conclusions. A boat was instantly sent on shore to inquire the meaning of the white flag. She quickly returned to the flagship, bringing the Indian mail, with a polite message from Suleiman Pacha, assuring the admiral that he was not at war with individuals, and that he should feel a satisfaction in forwarding all letters to and from India. Sir Robert Stopford, himself so generous and polite, was the very man to appreciate such an act of courtesy. He therefore sent back the boat immediately with a case of wine, warmly thanking the Pacha, and begging that he would accept it as a slight acknowledgment of his kindness. This little episode over, the belligerents began firing away at each other as hard as ever. The Pacha showed that he was as brave as he was courteous, for in spite of all the cannonading he would not give in. A short drama was, however, enacted, which showed the midshipmen a little more of the realities of war. An Egyptian deserter came on board one of the ships, and gave notice that a train of gunpowder had been laid along a bridge leading to the eastern castle, in which was collected a large quantity of gunpowder, with the intention of blowing up into the sky any of the besiegers who might succeed in entering the place. The deserter offered to guide any party formed to cut off the train. Commander Worth of the Hastings undertook to accomplish the dangerous service, and a number of officers and men volunteered to accompany him. Jack and Murray and Adair were among others eager to go. However, it was not likely that more than one midshipman from the frigate would be allowed to accompany the expedition. The morning of the day in which it was to take place, Murray had been sent with a message on board the Hastings. He came back with a flush on his cheek and a look of intense satisfaction on his countenance. "Jack, Terence, my dear fellows, congratulate me. I'm to go. W., who has known me for some time, has applied for me. He did so in most flattering terms. He said he wanted a midshipman who would be calm and collected whatever might occur, and yet one on whose courage and resolution he could perfectly rely, and he has selected me. It is that he has spoken of me in such flattering terms that has given me so much pleasure. I wish that you two fellows were going also." "I wish we were," said Jack, "but I congratulate you, Alex. You'll do justice to W.'s choice. That I know right well. There will be more work to be done than when we attacked the pirates' stronghold the other day," observed Adair. "Well, I hope that my turn will come before long. I don't feel as if I had any right to wear starch in my shirt collar till I've taken part in some real downright fighting." Jack and Terence warmly shook Murray's hand as he stepped into the boat which was to convey him on board the Hastings. "I say, old fellow, don't now forget to come back to us safe and sound in life and limb," cried Terence, laughing. "Remember the fright I gave you and Jack. Don't give him and me the same, and we'll take care that Pigeon does not malign your character in your absence." Away went Murray. To say that he was in a high glee would be to use a wrong term. There was a calm satisfaction and proud joy in his heart at the thought that the time had arrived when he might have an opportunity of distinguishing himself in the noble profession he had chosen, and to which he was so devoutly attached. Neither Roger nor Adair would have felt as he did, yet in reality he was the bravest of all three, because his mind was so constituted that he clearly saw all the dangers to be encountered and knew every risk he was running. The expedition rendezvoused around the Hastings. The ships stood in as close as the depths of water would allow them, and then, opening their fire, the boats shoved off and pulled away for the bridge which led to the castle. As soon as they approached, a heavy fire of musketry was opened upon them from the fortifications, but in the face of it the men clambered upon the bridge, and, led by their gallant commander, rapidly pushed across it. Jack and Terence eagerly watched the progress of the boats through their telescopes. Their chief sympathy was concentrated on that which contained Murray and his fortunes. They looked upon him as a dear brother, and, in spite of their apparent light-heartedness, they both felt the deepest anxiety for his safety. In a very short time the whole party were hid from sight by the thick smoke which surrounded them. Murray, with his brave companions, in spite of the leaden shower which came pattering around their heads, pushed on till they reached the spot where the train was laid. A few buckets of water, brought for the purpose, quickly cut off the train. Then on they went to the gates of the castle. They were not long in blowing it open. In they rushed, putting the defenders to flight, who made their escape by the opposite gate, rejoicing in the belief that the infidel besiegers would soon be blown up sky high, and become the food of ghouls and vampires. They were sorely disappointed when they found that the castle did not blow up, and that the Giers had taken entire possession of it. The English leader saw that no time was to be lost. He and his men hunted about and soon came upon the casks of powder of which they were in search. "Now, my lads, heave them over the walls into the sea," he sang out, setting the example which the men were ready enough to follow. Cast after cast were stuffed and thrown into the sea till some 60 or 70 casks had been destroyed. Sentries had been placed to give notice of the approach of the enemy. Notice was given that they were returning in force. "Now, my lads," cried Captain W., "we'll carry off some of these casks to pepper the fellows with their own powder." The idea just suited the taste of the seamen. Each man shouldered a cask, and, fearless of the consequences should a spark of fire get inside one of them, away they scampered through the gates and across the bridge with their booty. As soon as the enemy caught sight of them they again opened their fire. Several of the daring party was hit. The officers cheered them on. The fire was hotter than ever. One officer fell. He was a midshipman. The men rallied round him, and lifting him up on their shoulders, bore him on towards the boats. He did not breathe or give sign of health. "Who is it? Who is it?" was asked. They reached the boats and shoved off, for the Egyptians were gathering in force to attack them. Jack and Terence, perched on the hammock nettings, were looking out for the return of the expedition. The frigate was close in, and the boats had to pass her on their way to their respective ships. One of the boats of the Hastings came first, the one in which Mary had embarked. A Union Jack was thrown over a part of the stern sheets. "Who have you there?" asked Jack, not able to restrain his anxiety. "A midshipman, sir, who has been killed," was the answer. "Oh, Terence, it must be Murray!" exclaimed Jack, almost falling off the hammock nettings overboard. "And yet, no, it can't be, it must not be. Who is he, that shipman?" shouted Jack. But the boat was already at some distance, and the people in her did not hear the question asked. The report soon got about the decks that Murray was killed. Jack and Adair would have been gratified at hearing all the things said about him, and the grief expressed at his loss. Still, after giving vent to their grief for a time, they began to hope that possibly he might not have been killed, but only desperately wounded, and they resolved to ask leave to go on board the Hastings to ascertain the state of the case. As they were going aft for that purpose, a boat came alongside, and in a few seconds afterwards, who should appear on deck uninjured in limb and in capital spirits but Murray himself. "Who are you? What are you? Where did you come from?" exclaimed Terence, scarcely knowing what he said. "Why, Alick, to a certainty you are dead, are you not?" "I hope not," answered Murray, laughing at the reception his two friends were giving him. "I have not been hit or hurt that I know of." "All right," exclaimed Jack, springing forward and grasping his hand. "It would have been too dreadful if you had been killed." "Unhappily, one poor fellow of our party, a midshipman L. of the Hastings, was killed," observed Murray. "However, let us promise each other for the future, not to fancy that any accident has happened to those who are absent, unless we have very strong evidence of the same." "Agreed, agreed," the other two exclaimed. "Whatever anybody else may tell us, we all believe that we shall meet again somewhere or other, and be happy together." It is extraordinary what an effect the notion of the three midshipmen had had on them. If Adair was away, though perhaps on some far distant station, Jack frequently had to say that he did not know where he was to be found, but he always added, "I am certain that we shall meet again before long." "What message shall I give him?" Murray said much the same thing of Jack or Adair, and they said the same of Murray. I cannot follow them through the various scenes of the war in Syria. While Sir Charles Napier, to his great delight, was acting the part of a general on shore, with some of his naval followers as his aides de camp, they were employed on board their ship, which, with the rest of the squadron, was engaged in sailing along the coast, in cooperating with the army, and in blowing up and capturing one fortress after another of those which still held out for Mehemet Ali. Now and then both bluejackets and marines landed, and, much to their satisfaction, stormed the old Pacha's strongholds, and literally fulfilled Charlie Napier's promise of pulling the stones about the ears of his governors. On one occasion success did not attend the British arms, but, as Paddy Adair observed, "It's an ill wind which blows no one good," and here he had an opportunity which he had so long desired of distinguishing himself. The fortress was a very strong one, with a high thick walled tower, which looked fully capable of defying the battle and the breeze for 1,000 years. The ship stood in with the intention of battering it down, but after firing away for an hour or more, little impression was made, and it was resolved to endeavour to take it by storm. Jack had to stay on board, greatly to his disgust, and he did not say that he considered himself a most ill-used officer. Adair and Murray accompanied the body of seamen who, with the marines of the squadron and some mountaineers who had been taken on board along the coast, were landed to form the storming party. The grounds between the castle and the sea were laid out in gardens. Here a body of the enemy was drawn up. The storming party landed to the south of the town, covered by the fire of the ships, which also cleared the gardens of the enemy. The marines and bluejackets now pushed bravely on, but encountered a terrible fire from the troops within the forts. Murray and Adair were side by side, scrambling over walls and leaping ditches, and cutting through the hedges of prickly pears, in spite of the showers of shot which rattled around their heads. "I say, Alick, poets talk of genial showers. I wonder what they would call the shower now rattling around us," cried Adair, as he waved on his men. "A leaden shower, I should think," said Alick. "Not far wrong, my boy, but I'm afraid it will not make us grow, though," answered Adair. "But I say, the shot do pepper through." They did, indeed. Numbers of the marines and sailors were knocked over. "There's another poor fellow down," cried Adair, stooping down to help up the man, but his aid was of no avail. A deep groan escaped from his bosom, his musket fell from his grasp, and he was dead. Adair, with a sigh, for the marine had been his servant, let go his hand and sprang on. In vain the British and their allies fired away at every loophole and embrasure where a man's head or firelock was to be seen. The enemy rattled away as rapidly as ever, and no impression seemed to be made on the walls, while numbers of the storming party were falling one after the other around. Now a poor fellow would spring up into the air shot through the head, and now would fall down with a groan and rolling over. clutched convulsively at the earth. One would utter a sharp shriek as he fell, others, with the blood streaming from their limbs, would endeavour to scramble on till they sank with a cry of pain, exhausted to the ground. The midshipmen now began to comprehend more clearly than they had ever before done the stern realities of warfare. They got within 30 yards of the wall when they found themselves in front of the crenelled outwork with a deep ditch before it. In vain the officers looked for some part of the castle wall which might prove practicable. Not a spot appeared accessible, and nothing but the ugly-looking muzzles of the enemy's muskets were visible through the loopholes. Most unwillingly was the command given to retire, and most unwillingly was it obeyed. "I say, Murray, I don't like this, to have to turn my tail on those red-capped gentry," exclaimed Adair. "We must obey orders, at all events," observed Murray. "Steady, my men, steady," he added, as some of the sailors were turning round to take a parting shot at the foe. The marines were drawn off in beautiful order, and the whole party were soon out of the reach of the shot. As they were pulling off, Murray and Adair remarked that a flag which had been planted in the garden in front of the fort was left flying. "That will never do, the enemy will be getting it," cried Adair. "I say, Alick, let you and I go and see if we cannot pull it down and carry it off." "With all my heart," answered Murray. "Let us put back at once. We must ask Captain A.'s leave as we pass his boat. He will not refuse it, I am sure." The crew of their boat were delighted at hearing what the midshipmen had resolved to do, and pulled back to the shore with a will. As they passed Captain A.'s boat, Adair sang out, "There's an English flag left flying on the shore there, sir. Those red-capped fellows will boast that they took it from us if we let it stay. May we go and get it?" The commander of the expedition saw that if it was to be done, no time was to be lost, as the risk to be run would increase by delay, or the Egyptians might see the flag and sally out and take it. "A brave idea. Go and prosper, my lads," he answered promptly. "Thank you, sir, thank you," answered Murray and Adair in one breath, while the crew bent with all their might to their oars. "Oh, Alick," said Adair, "I do wish that Roger was with us. This is just the thing of all others he would have liked." "I wish he was, indeed," answered Murray, "but I daresay something else will turn up before long in which he may be able to take a part." The boat very soon reached the shore. All the crew wanted to go on the expedition, but the midshipmen would only consent to take one. They had their cutlasses by their sides, and pistols in their belts, but their arms were not likely to be of much use. The instant the boat's stem touched the beach, they sprang on shore, and running along the beach, scrambled over the first wall they encountered, and found themselves in the garden. Scarcely were they there when the sharp eyes of the enemy fell on them, and they were saluted with a hot fire of musketry. "Skip about, dodge them, fly here, fly there, take care they don't hit you," sang out Paddy, suiting the action to the word. "The more we jump the less chance we shall have of being hit." The midshipmen's movements, as they hurried on, were not unlike those of the wills of the wisp. The enemy could not conceive what they had come for, and probably supposed that they were madmen who had escaped on shore and were coming to join them. For a short time the firing ceased. As the smoke cleared off, those on board the ship could see what was taking place, as well as could the enemy. Every glass was turned towards them. Jack, among others, recognised his friends, and saw what they were about. They were not wrong in supposing that he would long to be with them. He would have given a finger, or even a right arm, for the sake of being of their party. On they went. They had another wall to get over. They climbed to the top of it. The enemy at last suspected what they were about, and came to the conclusion that if they were mad they had a method in their madness. So they began once more furiously firing away at them. Eastern matchlocks are fortunately not like Enfield rifles, or their lives, if they had 9, like cats, whom they so resembled in their activity, would not have been worth a moment's purchase. Murray and Adair raced on as merrily as if they had been playing a game of prisoner's base. They clambered up a wall, at top of which the flagstaff had been placed. They waved it about their heads, and giving a loud cheer, down they leaped to the ground, where their companion was ready to receive them. Happily they did so, for the next moment a thick shower of musket balls came rattling across the spot they had left. "Not hit, Alick?" asked Adair, as they scrambled back as hard as their legs would carry them. "No, I hope you are not," said Murray. "Can't say for a certainty," answered Terence. "I feel a funny stinging sensation in my side, as if something or other was the matter." Whatever it was, it did not impede his speed. At length it seemed to strike the Egyptians that though they could not manage to knock over the young giaours with their matchlocks, they might with their scimitars. So a band of fierce-looking fellows with long mustachios, wonderfully wide breeches, and gleaming blades, sallied out of the fortress to endeavour to overtake them. The Egyptians ran very fast and felt very savage, but they might just as well have tried to catch 3 active tom cats. Dick Needham, their companion, was the first to perceive that the enemy was in pursuit of them. "There's a lot of them scampering after us, sir," he observed coolly. "All right," answered Terence. "They're friends inside the fort. Then we'll be less likely to keep firing at us, and I should like to see the followers of the Prophet, whether Turk or Egyptian, who can match us in a fair race like this." To them justice, however, the enemy made good play over the ground. The outside garden wall was reached and leaped, and now there were 3 adventurers had a fair run for it along the beach towards their boat, with the red-capped gentlemen, as Adair called them, in hot pursuit. A long straggling branch of a tree had been thrown upon the beach. Adair did not observe it, and suddenly he found himself toppled over on his head. He thought that he had broken his leg. "Take the flag and run, Alick," he exclaimed, throwing the flagstaff to Murray. "Never mind me, I'm too much hurt to move." "Not when I have a pair of legs to run off with you, sir," cried Dick Needham, lifting Paddy upon his shoulders, running off with him as if he had been a baby. "It was not for that, sir, that I come here to look after you." Paddy felt that it was not a moment to stand on his dignity, so he was very much obliged to Dick for carrying him. Murray took the flag, but would not leave him till he had seen him hoisted upon Dick's shoulders. Away they went as before, but the Egyptians had gained considerably on them, and hallooed and shouted, and, worse than all, fired off their pistols with good as aim as they could take, running as they were at full speed. Fortunately the bullets did not reach the fugitives. Just then the latter caught sight of their boat, which they had left under a shelter of a rock. The Egyptians did not see her, and so ran on, which they otherwise would not have done. What was their surprise, then, to find themselves saluted with a round of grape shot from a gun in her bows, and a volley of musketry, while a true British cheer reached their ears. Dick and Murray responded to it, and so did Paddy in a voice which showed that there was not much the matter with him, and all 3 very speedily tumbled into the boat, while the enemy turned tail and scattered back to the fort. The boat immediately shoved off to return to the frigate. "What is the matter with you, Paddy?" asked Murray, as soon as they had taken their seats. "I hope you are not much hurt. Let me see." "My knee bothers me a little, but my side is the worst," answered Adair. and, as I am a gentleman, look here, the fellows have shot away the handle of my sword." Such was the case. Adair had indeed had a narrow escape. His coat was torn, and his skin slightly grazed, an eighth of an inch on one side, and he would have received a very ugly, if not a mortal wound. Happily he was very little hurt, and the cheers from which the boat was received, as she got alongside the frigate, made him forget entirely that anything was the matter with him. "Oh, I'm so jealous of you two fellows!" exclaimed Jack, as they were all seated together in the berths. "You'll make me volunteer to lead a forlorn hope, or to do something terrifically heroic. However, the fun is not yet over. We shall have plenty more work to do before long." The fun, as Jack called it, was not over. Sidon was soon afterwards attacked by a squadron under Sir Charles Napier, in his usual slash-dashed gallant determined to conquer manner. The ships bombarded, then the Turks, Marines, and Bluejackets were landed, and stormed one castle after another, killing or putting to flight everyone who opposed them. Jack, Murray, and Adair, to their great delight, were all on shore together. The cannonading had not, however, driven the Egyptians from their entrenchments, so the ships again opened their fire. Captain Austin, at the head of the Turkish battalion, had taken one castle. Captain Mansell, with great gallantry, led a body of marines into another, and then they fought their way into another castle which overlooked the town, not, however, without some loss. And now the commodore conceived that the time had come for storming the town itself, and putting himself at the head of the troops, he led them on. The three midshipmen, with a body of seamen from the different ships, were with him. They broke into some strongly fortified barracks, and drove out the enemy. Then they fought their way through the streets to the citadel. Several boats had brought their ensigns. Jack carried theirs at the end of a pole. "Hurrah now!" he sang out. "Let us have our colours on the top of the wall before any one else." Terence and Murray echoed the sentiment, and, leading on some of their men, they endeavoured to reach the spot before a boat's crew of their Austrian allies, led on by a midshipman, as well as before other parties of British seamen. Never was there a better race. No one felt inclined to stop at obstacles, and everybody who attempted to oppose them was killed. The governor of the town was encountered. He was offered quarter, but he would not receive it, and before any officers could interfere, two marines ran the brave old gentleman through the body, and he died like a true Turk as he was. When the enemy saw that their chief was dead, and that there was no one to lead them, they wisely threw down their arms, resolved, like brave men, to live and fight another day for a more profitable cause. Jack and his companions pushed on, and having now fewer enemies to encounter, made still greater progress. The higher part of the town was reached. With shouts and loud huzzas they scrambled up to the summit of the walls, and, planting the British banner, Sidon was proclaimed to have fallen into the power of the allies. Fortunately the commodore and his followers came upon 1,000 men concealed in a vaulted barrack, who were prepared to rush out and cut them off, but who, instead, were very glad to lay down their arms, and in the end every one of the garrison, 3,000 in number, was captured. Tyre, that ancient city, was next captured, so was Caffa, Tortosa, and other places, and at last the fleet appeared before Acre, still one of the most important places on the Syrian coast. Here the midshipmen saw what real fighting was. Acre presented two sides to the sea, one facing south and the other west. In consequence of this it was necessary that the fleet should attack in two divisions. It was a grand sight to see the mighty line of battle ships and the fine steamers armed with their engines of destruction in order the devout town, and still more when they began thundering away from 1,000 loud-mouthed guns, confusing the senses with their oars and filling the air with their smoke. Even Jack felt his spirits awed as hour after hour, without cessation, the mighty uproar continued, and houses were overthrown, and stone walls were seen crumbling away before the reiterated shocks of the iron shower levelled at them. The enemy, too, were not idle, and shots and shells came whizzing about the ships, striking down here and there many a gallant seaman and marine. "Well, Alick, what do you think of it?" asked Jack, as, in the course of their duty, the two friends were brought together. "That we are in earnest in what we are about, though I wish I could feel the poor fellows we are slaughtering deserve their fate more than I think they do," answered Murray. "I don't understand those niceties," observed Terence, who had just then come up. "Those fellows don't do what we tell them, so we've a perfect right to kill and destroy them as fast as we can. But hallo, what's that?" As Adair was speaking, a terrible noise, 10 times louder than the roar of all the guns of the squadron put together, was heard, and high up into the air were seen to ascend fragments of walls and beams, and human bodies, succeeded by a dense smoke, out of which flames burst forth and raged furiously. The castle had blown up, or rather the grand magazine within it, and in a moment nearly 2,000 persons were hurried into eternity. The firing ceased. The combatants held their breath, aghast at the terrible catastrophe, but the Egyptians, undaunted, soon again recommenced the action, and the ships bombarded on as before till sunset, when the action was discontinued. "What tough fellows those must be to hold out so long," said Jack. "I should have thought they would have had enough of it before this." The governor had already come to the same conclusion, and during the night he and his followers evacuated the place, and in the morning some Turks and Austrians were sent on shore to take possession. The capture of Acre terminated the war in Syria, for many of the tribes which had been hesitating which side to choose, chose the Sultan's forces, and the army of Ibrahim Pacha dwindled from 75,000 to 20,000 men. Sir Charles Napier went to Alexandria, and Mehemet Ali, persuaded that the tide of war had turned against him, undertook to evacuate Syria and to restore the Turkish fleet as soon as the Sultan should send him a firman granting him the hereditary government of Egypt. Everybody engaged in the Syrian war got a great deal of credit, and my three friends came in for a midshipman's share of the honours showered on the victors. Once more the Racer was ploughing the waters of the Mediterranean with her head to the westward. She had been her full time on the station, and it was the general expectation that she would speedily be ordered home. "Hurrah for old England!" was the joyous cry on board, and no one enjoyed the thoughts of returning home more than did the three friends, and yet there was a lump of bitter in the bottom of the cup to spoil this pleasure. It was the thought that in all probability they would soon separate. For how long they could not guess. Perhaps years might pass away before they could meet again. They resolved, however, to stick together if they could, and, at all events, never to fail in letting each other know their whereabouts. The Racer reached Portsmouth at last. There was a paying off dinner, given by the midshipmen to the gunroom officers, at the far famed Blue Posts. Old Hemming presided, and a very good president he made. The first course was over when the stumping on the stairs was heard, and the waiter, opening the door, announced Admiral Triton. Jack sprang up and grasped his hand warmly. "I have taken the liberty of an old seaman to look in on you, gentlemen, on this occasion, uninvited, for I saw it just as you were all brought together, and I was anxious to meet you again before all separate, probably forever," said the Admiral, who, as may be supposed, was most cordially welcomed, after waiting for some time till the speech making had begun. "You have had, I am glad to find from my friends Rogers, a happy ship. Many of you will, I hope, some day be captains, and let me impress it on you that on you yourselves will then mainly depend whether your ships also are happy ships, or the reverse. To make them so you must command your tempers. You cannot begin too soon to practise the difficult task. You must endeavour to study and promote the true interests of all under you, and you must act justly towards all men. To do this I must not fail to remind you that you must pray for strength, whence alone strength for all difficult tasks can be given." The Admiral's speech in no way interrupted the hilarity of the evening, and he added much to it by several amusing anecdotes, at which no one laughed more heartily than he did. The next day he accompanied Jack to Northamptonshire. No one was ever more cordially welcomed in a happy home than was Jack. It need not be said that, for at least 3 days, everybody did their utmost to spoil him, though after that time he was treated very much as he used to be before he became a midshipman. Chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of The Three Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Three Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 8. Bound for Africa. One morning, towards the termination of breakfast, Jack Rogers was leaning back in his chair with a bit of buttered toast in one hand and the Times in the other, on the contents of which he was making a running commentary, when he stopped short, put down his toast, took a hurried sip of his tea, and exclaimed, "So my old skipper has got his ship again, and they say is going out as Commodore to the coast of Africa." "Dear me," observed Mrs. Rogers, "I am afraid that Captain Lascelles will not like that. I should always have such a horror of that dreadful station." "Oh, mother, don't pray entertain such a notion as that," said Jack, with no little emphasis. "There is in the first place plenty of work to be done there, which in these piping times of peace is a great consideration. Only think of the fun of capturing a slaver, and what is more, of getting an independent command, or at least that is of a prize, you know, and being away from one's ship for weeks together. And then there is cruising in open boats, and exploring rivers, and fights with pirates or slavers, perhaps a skirmish with the dependents of some nigger potentate, and 50 other sorts of adventures, not to speak of prize money and all that sort of thing. You know. Oh, to my mind, the coast of Africa is one of the best stations in the world, in spite of what is said against it." When Jack made this assertion, he had never been there. He talked on till he had worked himself up to a fit of enthusiasm, and almost made his family believe that the African station was not so bad a one after all. The truth was that when Captain Lascelles paid off the racer he promised Jack that should he get another ship soon he would apply for him, and Jack therefore felt pretty certain that he should himself be very soon on station, and he of course was anxious to prevent his parents or sisters from feeling any undue anxiety on his account. He could not sit down or turn his mind to anything all day till he discovered a copy of The Cruise of the Midge, over the graphic pages of which he was observed to be intently poring. And then he went and routed out of the library 1 or 2 books descriptive of the west coast of Africa. At dinner he could talk of nothing else but the Gold Coast and the Ivory Coast, and Congo, and other places in those regions. "Why, Jack, we might suppose that you were contemplating going out there from the way you talk about those places," observed one of his brothers, who wanted to bring some other subject on the tapis. "And so of course I am," explained Jack. "I should like to stay at home among you all, but as I have chosen a profession, and there is not another like it, I hope to stick to it, and I intend always to look out where there is most work to be done, and to go there." "My dear child," said his mother, "but not to the coast of Africa." Then Jack went into all the arguments in its favor, which he flattered himself had made so favorable an impression at breakfast, but which he found had all been forgotten, while the original very natural prejudice against it had once more asserted a preeminence in the minds of his family. The next morning Jack was unusually fidgety till the post came in, and there was a blank look on his countenance when the post-bag was opened and it produced no letter for him. Soon after breakfast, however, Admiral Triton's carriage drove up to the door, and out of it stepped the Admiral himself. He quickly stumped into the drawing-room, and having made his salams to the ladies, produced an official-looking document from his pocket. Jack had followed him eagerly into the room. "Here, my boy," said he, "is a letter from my friend Lascelles, your old captain. He says, let me see what he says. Oh, here it is. I cannot find the address of Jack Rogers. So pray tell him to come down to Portsmouth at once and join the Ranger. I have just been appointed to her to go out as Commodore on the African station. Let his outfit be got ready accordingly. I have no doubt that he will find some opportunity of distinguishing himself, and as he has already served 4 years, there is a fair chance of his getting his promotion when he returns home." "The rest is private," observed the Admiral, when he had concluded this somewhat laconic epistle. "And now, Jack, I congratulate you, my lad," he continued. "You have been quite long enough on shore to rub up your shore manners, and that is as long as a midshipman ought to remain at home. How soon shall you be ready?" "In 10 days or a fortnight, I think that I can get his shirts and flannel waistcoats made, and his socks marked, and his—" "I beg your pardon, my dear madam, but by that time the Ranger may be halfway across the Bay of Biscay. 10 or 14 hours, you should say. He must go and see his ship fitted out. He'll never be at home in her unless he does. Well, then the day after tomorrow I intend to go down with him. I enjoyed my last trip so much that I would not miss the opportunity of seeing him on board his new ship. I know what you would say, my dear madam, but a longer delay would be objectionable. Rogers will agree with me. There, it is settled, so let us say no more about the matter." Thus Jack found himself, more speedily than he expected, about to go once more afloat. That afternoon, in company with 2 of his brothers and his sister Mary, he galloped round and paid his farewells to his friends in the neighborhood. And then his chest was packed, the contents of which all the womankind in and out of the house, for a long way round, had been employed without cessation, night and day, in getting ready. So when the Admiral, as he had done 4 years before, drove up to the door, he was perfectly ready to accompany him. Jack did his best to keep up the spirits of his mother and sister to the last, though just as he was going they gave way, and he himself was nearly upset. All the fighting he had seen had not hardened his heart. Away he and the Admiral went down to Portsmouth. The next morning they were soon after breakfast on board the Ranger, then fitting out alongside a hulk. She was a 36-gun frigate, no great improvement on the Racer, but still a ship which an actively disposed officer might well be glad to get. Several of the officers had already joined, and the Admiral made a few favorable remarks about Jack, which placed him at once in a favorable light in their eyes. Captain Lascelles, who was living on shore, welcomed him very kindly, and Jack was very well pleased with what he saw of his future companions. The 3rd lieutenant of the frigate had not been appointed. However, 3 or 4 days after Jack had joined, who should make his appearance but old Hemming, who had, on the paying off of the Racer, got his somewhat tardy promotion. Jack did not know that he was promoted, and was not a little pleased to find that he was their 3rd lieutenant. Jack had written to Adair and Murray directly he found that he was appointed to the Ranger, urging them to exert all their interest to get appointed to her likewise, but he had not yet heard from either of them. One was in Ireland, the other in Scotland. Hemming laughed when he told him what he had done. Their friends may take some trouble to get them on board a ship going to the Mediterranean, or to keep them on their home station, but depend on it, they will not bestir themselves to have them sent out to the coast, he remarked. Captain Lascelles' character was well known, so he soon got his ship manned and ready for sea. Admiral Triton had gone over to the Isle of Wight, and now came off to Spithead to see the last of them. There was still room for another midshipman. They were expecting every day to sail, and Jack was in despair at not hearing from either of his friends, wondering what would have become of them, when a shore boat was seen coming off to the ship, and Paddy Adair and his chest came up to the side. "Hurrah!" exclaimed Jack as soon as he saw him. "That is jolly. But I say, old fellow, where is Murray? I wish that he was here too." Adair could not tell, and they puzzled their brains in vain to account for his silence. The topsails were loosed, the capstan was manned, and to a merry tune the men were running round and heaving up the anchor. And as the fine old admiral was shaking hands with all he knew on board just before stepping into his boat, Jack could scarcely persuade himself that 4 years had passed over his head since, with the exception that Murray was not present as one of the dramatis persona. Precisely the same scene had been enacted. The Ranger had a quick run to Sierra Leone, where her arrival was welcomed with very great delight by all on board the ship she came to relieve. The frigate at last cast anchor opposite Freetown, and Jack and Adair were allowed with several of the officers to go on shore. They were surprised at finding so large and flourishing a town, with a population, although the greater number are black or colored, so generally intelligent and well off. They saw churches and colleges and schools and places of education of all sorts. They were told that many of the Negroes liberated from slavers have become wealthy, and that the sons of men who landed on those shores 20 years ago, ignorant savages, are now receiving a first-rate education and studying Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, many of them diligently preparing for becoming ministers of the gospel. Freetown, built on rising ground close to the sea, has a very picturesque appearance. Jack and Adair were also struck with the number of people who came into the town to trade, and with signs of industry everywhere visible. However, they were not sorry to find themselves once more at sea, with a sharp lookout kept night and day for slavers. The officers were in general very different in appearance from those in the Racer, though they were all very good sort of fellows. The oddest looking was Dr. McCann, the surgeon. He was a jovial-faced, short man, and from having lived a life of ease on shore, he had grown enormously fat. As he had also got into a very comfortable practice, he did not at all like coming to sea, but at the same time, as he was a true philosopher, instead of moaning and groaning, he tried to make himself as happy as under the circumstances he was able. The first lieutenant was a veteran of the old school, tall and thin, but as lithe and agile as he had been when he was 20 years younger. He was constantly employed, because every captain who knew him wanted him as the first lieutenant, and so, because he was so very good in that capacity, John Holt remained still a lieutenant. He did not complain beyond an occasional grumble. Indeed, those who knew him suspected that he rather preferred being looked on as one of the best first lieutenants instead of holding a higher rank, when he would have had to remain on shore and be forgotten. The second lieutenant and master were both rough and ready seamen, short, strongly built men, with light hair and large bushy whiskers and beard. They were wonderfully like each other. The purser was one of the most gentlemanly and best educated men in the ship. The marine officer was also a very excellent fellow, but he squinted awfully, which made him carry his head somewhat on one side, and his face was broad and strongly seamed with lines, which twisted in a way that made him look as if he was always laughing. He however did laugh very frequently, more especially at his own jokes, which, if not always original, were very amusing. In the midshipmen's berth there were several mates of long standing, who had come out on the station in the hopes of getting their promotion, while besides Rogers and Adair there were 3 other midshipmen, with their usual complement of other grades. The frigate lay long enough off Freetown to make everyone rejoice to find themselves once more at sea. Lookouts were constantly aloft on the watch for slavers. They had not been at sea many days when the exciting cry of "Sail ho!" was heard from the masthead. Several of the officers were soon seen going up the rigging with their spyglasses slung over their shoulders to look out for the stranger. She was made out to be a ship dead to leeward. All sail was instantly made in chase. She might be a merchantman or possibly a man of war, but that was not likely, and Captain Lascelles had received information that a large slave ship was expected off the coast. It was not till nearly an hour had elapsed that the stranger bore up and made sail to escape. This left no doubt as to her character, and everyone looked forward to the capture of an important prize. The frigate sailed remarkably well, but a stern chase is a long chase, and several hours more passed before the topsails of the stranger were seen above the horizon. Jack and Terence could scarcely tear themselves from the deck even to go below to dinner. "I say, Paddy," observed the former, "I wonder whether you or I shall be sent away in her when we take her. Will Hemming go in command, or will one of the mates, Lee or Whedon, perhaps?" "Let us catch our hare before we eat her," said Adair. "I tell you what I do wish, that we were in a smaller craft, and then you and I would have a chance of getting sent away together. Wouldn't that be fun?" Jack agreed that it would, but both of them began to look very blank when darkness closed in on them, and the chase was still several miles ahead. When the frigate first made out the chase, she was standing to the eastward, and was about 100 miles off Cape Palmas. She was then running towards the Bay of Biafra. Captain Lascelles kept the frigate on nearly the same course, edging slightly in towards the land, for he suspected that the ship was bound in for one of the harbors on the Gold or Slave Coast, and would probably stand in towards the land during the night. Neither of the midshipmen turned in that night. The thought that they were about to take their first prize kept, indeed, many others out of their hammocks, and sharp eyes were on the watch for her in every direction during the night. In spite of their sharpness, however, not a sign of the chase could be discovered. Yet as she was not seen on either hand, the probabilities were that she was still ahead. "Do you know, Terence, this reminds me of the time when we chased the Turkish frigate, which had you on board, off the Egyptian coast," said Jack. "I only hope that we may be more fortunate and catch her before she gets on shore and blows up." "I shall be glad if we catch her on the water, or earth, or sky," answered Terence. "These slavers are slippery fellows, and it is no easy matter to get hold of them." The night wore on. When the morning at length broke, the mastheads were crowded with visitors. They rubbed their eyes and their telescopes, and then looked through the latter, and rubbed again, and then they pulled very long faces at each other, for the ship could nowhere be seen. Many of them remained aloft, still looking for her, but at last they came down and looked at each other, and voted themselves sold. However, they went to breakfast, and as they walked the deck after it, they hoped that they might have better luck next time. The men's dinner was just over, when once more everybody was put on the alert by hearing "Sail ho!" sung out from the masthead. "Where away?" asked Captain Lascelles, who was walking the deck at the time. "Right ahead, sir," was the answer. The captain himself went aloft. When he came down again, he told Mr. Holt that he believed she was the identical ship that they had chased the previous day. The frigate rapidly got up with her. "How jolly to think that we shall catch her after all!" exclaimed Jack, as they got near enough to the chase to see halfway down her courses. "But what is the matter with her? She seems to have altered her course." "She is becalmed, to be sure," answered Lieutenant Hemming, who heard the question. "Daddy Neptune has brought her up all standing, to place her as a punishment in our power. I only hope he will not make a mistake and becalm us till we get up to her." In another hour or less the stranger was seen floating in the middle of a shining sheet of water of silvery hue. Still the frigate carried on the breeze. It was a question whether the stranger would get it, and perhaps make a fresh start, leaving her pursuer in the lurch. The excitement on board the frigate became greater than ever when the stranger was seen, for there was no longer any doubt about her character. Her taut masts, her square yards, the great hoist of her topsail, and her light cotton canvas, all showed her to be a slaver, probably combined with the occupation of a pirate. Gradually the wind decreased as the frigate neared her. When within about a couple of miles it fell a dead calm. Captain Lascelles gave a rapid glance round the horizon, and then ordered away the first and second cutters with a large whaleboat, and directed the second and third lieutenants and one of the mates to join them. Jack and Terence got leave to accompany Mr. Hemming. It was very evident, from the appearance of the stranger, that she would give them some tough work before they took her. With loud cheers the expedition shoved off from the frigate's side and pulled away from the ship. The 3 boats contained altogether from 35 to 40 hands. It was broad daylight. There would have been no use in disguising their intentions. If the slaver attempted to defend herself at all, they might well expect some desperate fighting, and from her appearance it could scarcely be expected that she would do otherwise. Hemming's boat, which pulled the fastest, got the lead. The men every now and then gave a cheer to animate each other. They rapidly neared the slaver as the smooth shining water bubbled and hissed under the boat's bows. Oh, how hot it was, as the sun's rays came directly down on their heads. But no one thought of the heat, and they laughed and joked as if they were employed in some amusing occupation. "I say, Paddy, I think we could do a beefsteak brown on these stern sheets," observed Jack, putting his hand down by his side. "That to be sure we might," answered Terence. "And here comes the pepper for them," he added, as the pirate sent a shower of round shot, grape, and canister flying around, and stirring up the water on every side, though fortunately no one was hit. "Give it them in return, my lads," cried the second lieutenant. "Marines, fire!" The Marines were not slow in obeying the order, and as the seamen bent to their oars, they continued firing away as fast as they could load. The slaver's crew had evidently hopes of crippling their adversaries, for they kept up a brisk and well-directed fire, but, hot as it was, the gallant British tars were undaunted. That dark ship has perhaps 400 or 500 poor wretches under hatches whom it is our business to set free," cried Lieutenant Hemming. "And then, my boys, if we do take her, what a lot of prize money we shall get! Hurrah, hurrah!" Hemming had been too long at sea not to know how to excite the spirit of seamen. "We shall have some tough work! Hurrah, hurrah! You'll knock over some of those pirates, depend on it." Each officer excited his men by similar cries. Their only fear was that a breeze might spring up, and that the enemy might escape them. However, though they pulled hard, nearly half an hour passed from the time the first shot was fired till they got up to the ship. "What an ugly set of cutthroats the fellows are," said Adair, pointing to the people who crowded the pirate's deck. "Let's be at them, Jack." Jack was quite ready to respond to the proposal. The 2 other boats boarded on the starboard side, amid a hot fire of language of all sorts poured down upon them. Hemming pulled up on the port bow, sprang up the side, and soon fought his way upon the deck. Jack and Adair were climbing in at one of the ports when the pirates fired the gun through it directly over their heads. "Come on, Paddy, come on," Jack sang out. But Adair had been knocked over into the bottom of the boat. Happily, however, he was only killed, as the Irish say, so he clambered up again and quickly followed his friend, accompanied by Dick Needham, who had joined the Ranger, and another seaman. Fortunate it was for the midshipmen that they had so stout and true a seaman as Dick Needham as their companion, for they encountered a desperate resistance from the pirates, and were instantly engaged in furious hand-to-hand combats. Meantime, so surrounded were they by their enemies that they could not tell what had become of the rest of their shipmates. More than once they were nearly driven back through the port by which they had entered. Jack saved Adair from an ugly cut on the head, and Adair in return saved Jack from being run through the body by cutting down the pirate who was making the attempt to do it. Both of them, as well as Dick Needham, were nearly exhausted, and poor Tom Bowles, their companion, had received a wound which brought him to the deck, when Hemming's voice was heard above their heads, and he leaped down from the forecastle, off which he had driven the enemy. With loud cheers he led on his men. The pirates gave way before them. Then Lieutenant Collard and Randall were seen fighting their way from aft. The pirates looked about them, and seeing enemies on every side, gave way, some leaping below, and some throwing themselves overboard. Fully a dozen pirates were killed, and a still greater number were wounded. Many did not even ask for quarter. Others threw themselves on their knees, as their captors followed them below, and entreated that their lives might be spared. The victory was not gained without loss. A marine and 2 seamen were killed and 5 were wounded, a large proportion out of the number composing the expedition. No sooner were the decks cleared than a terrific howl was heard from below. Mr. Hemming rushed to the hold. Just at that moment a whole host of negroes were seen emerging from it. He was barely in time to drive them back again. "I know the rascally slavers' trick," he exclaimed. "They have been telling the poor wretches that we are going to murder them, and if they once had gained the deck, we should have had no little difficulty in preventing them from murdering us." Then, looking down the hold on the heaving mass of black humanity, he cried out, "Hear me, you piratical rascals! If you don't make these poor Negro fellows understand that we are their friends, and have come to set them free, we'll hang every one of you at your own yardarms before 10 minutes. He knew that many of the crew understood English perfectly, indeed that some of them were English and Americans. The pirates, finding that their plot was defeated, wisely came on deck, having explained to the slave that no harm was going to happen to them. As they came up they were secured by the manacles which they had prepared for their unhappy captives. Some time was thus employed, and at length a breeze sprang up, and the frigate was seen bearing down upon them. The prisoners looked very blank when they found that they were to be transferred to her. The gallantry of every one engaged was warmly commended by Captain Lascelles. Hemming got the command of the prize, and to their great delight Jack and Terence were allowed to remain in her. The frigate and her prize then made sail together for Sierra Leone. They kept close in with the land in the hopes of picking up another prize. Before, however, they got round Cape Palmas they met with a strong westerly gale, which compelled them to bring up in a sheltered bay, which is to be found some way to the eastward of it. The scenery was not very interesting. Near them was a narrow neck of sand, with a few palm trees on it, and a muddy lagoon on the other side. Still, men who have been long aboard are glad to find anything like firm ground on which to stretch their legs. Now the surgeon and the lieutenant of marines were constantly joking each other as to which of them possessed the greatest physical powers. If one boasted he had ridden 50 miles without stopping, the other had always gone 10 miles farther. If one had leaped over a wide ditch, the other had leaped over one 5 feet wider. Or, if one said he had kept up a Scotch reel for an hour, the other had danced one for a quarter of an hour longer. "I'll tell you what, Doctor," explained Lieutenant Stokes. "I'll undertake to race you for a mile, each of us carrying another person on our backs." "Done," cried Dr. McCann. "It shall come off at once. I'll take Adair as my jockey. You can take whom you like." Adair was the lightest midshipman on board, and the doctor thought that by getting him he had stolen a march on his military competitor. "Agreed," answered Lieutenant Stokes, cocking his squinting eye in the most ludicrous way. "I'll take Rogers. He's a bit heavier than Adair, but I don't mind that. As you had the first choice of a rider, I must choose the ground. From the extreme end of that spit of land to the palm trees near the neck is, I guess, about a mile." This was said while the frigate and her prize were brought up on their voyage to Sierra Leone. Dr. McCann looked at the white spit of sand and thought what heavy work it would be running over it, but he felt that he was in honor bound to keep to the proposed terms. A party was soon made up to go on shore, and all hands looked forward to the fun they expected to enjoy from the exhibition. They had first to pull alongside the prize to call for Rogers and Adair. Hemming gave them leave to go, and they of course were nothing loath to accept the invitation. What Captain Lascelles would have thought of the matter I don't know. He might have considered that the exhibition of an officer of Marines racing with a midshipman on his back was somewhat subversive of discipline. There was no surf on the shore, and the boats landed without difficulty. The ground was measured by the umpires. It was from the end of the point round the palm trees and back again about a quarter of the distance to make up the mile. The doctor felt the sand with his feet. It was very fine and soft, and he began to repent of his proposal. "Now, gentlemen, take up your burdens and be ready at the starting post," said the master, who was chief umpire. They went to the ground, tossing up the midshipmen to make them sit comfortably on their backs. "Now, 1, 2, 3, and away you go," cried the master. Off they went, the marine officer prancing away with Jack in the pride of his strength, while the doctor plowed his way steadily on through the sand, finding, even with Adair, that he had rather more flesh and blood to carry than was pleasant. Still, Mr. Stokes did not gain upon him. He, too, found that Rogers was no slight weight, though he was only a midshipman. As Jack said of himself, "All that is of me is good." For some time they were neck and neck. Hot enough they found it, for the sun was bright, the sand was soft, there was but little air, and what there was in their backs. They were lightly clad, to be sure, but had they worn as little clothing as the most unsophisticated of Negroes, they would have found it hot enough. They puffed, and they blew, and they strained, but still they persevered. At first neither Rogers nor Adair cared much about the matter, but they soon got as excited as the men who carried them, and eager for their respective steeds to win. "I say, Doctor," observed Adair, after they had gone about half the distance, "the sand inside of us there, along the lagoon, looks hard. It would not take us much out of our way if we were to go there, and you would then get along famously." Terence intended to give good counsel, and the doctor followed it. To his great delight he found the ground hard, and was getting on at a great rate. Jack urged Mr. Stokes to take the same route. "Stay a bit, all is not gold that glitters," was the answer. "That's treacherous sort of ground." "But see how magnificently they get along," cried Jack, again wishing that he had a bridle to guide his refractory steed. All this time the umpires and other spectators were keeping up merry shouts of laughter. "There they go," shouted Jack. "They will be round the trees in no time." Just as he spoke there was a loud hullabaloo from Terence, echoed by the doctor. Over they both went head first, but the doctor's heels did not follow, for they had stuck fast in the mud, into which poor Terence's head plunged with a loud thud. The doctor heroically endeavored to pull him out, but his own legs only stuck deeper and deeper. As the marine officer came up and passed by them, he began capering about and neighing in triumph, while Jack barbarously inquired whether they would like to have a tow. At last Terence, covered with mud, black and most ill-odorous, scrambled out, and by throwing to him the end of his handkerchief, contrived to haul out the doctor, who once more took him on his shoulders, and in sorry plight continued his course. Jack looked round and saw them coming just as Mr. Stokes was about to round the palm trees. He crowed loudly and waved his hand. It would have been wiser, however, if he had not begun to triumph so soon, for his steed's foot catching in a falling and half-hidden branch, over they went, and were half buried and almost stifled in the soft, hot sand. However, they picked themselves up, and Jack, mounting, away they went towards the goal where their friends were ready to receive them. Just as they got up to it, down came the gallant marine once more, but Jack stuck to his back, and on all fours he crawled up to the winning post. The poor doctor, with Terence, as Jack said, like a huge baboon clinging behind him, came in soon after, and the doctor declared that it was the last time, with or without a jockey, he would ever run a race on the shores of Africa or anywhere else. In the afternoon, the blacks and parties were taken on shore under an armed escort to bathe and exercise themselves, and the next day, the wind shifting, the frigate and captured slaver again made sail for their destination. "The frigate is signalizing to us," said Jack one morning to Lieutenant Hemming, who had just come on deck. "She is going in chase of a sail to the southward. We are to continue our course for Sierra Leone." In a couple of hours the frigate was out of sight. There appeared to be every promise of fine weather. Hemming's chief concern was for the blacks, who were sickly. Several had already died, and not a day passed without 4 or 5 being added to the number. It was important, therefore, to make the passage as quickly as possible. For this object the commanding officer kept probably more sail on the ship than she would otherwise have carried. Jack one afternoon had charge of the watch. All seemed satisfactory. As he was taking a turn on deck, he saw Dick Needham hurrying towards him and pointing to the sea to leeward. It was a mass of white foam. He shouted out, "All hands, shorten sail!" Hemming and Adair rushed out of the cabin. Hemming, without speaking, seized an axe and began cutting away at the halyards. Adair and Jack followed his example. The crew flew into the rigging with their knives, but it was too late. The tornado was upon them. Over went the ship. Down, down she heeled. The seething water rushed in at her ports. Shrieks and cries arose from the unhappy negroes confined below. Jack and Needham's first impulse was to knock off the hatches, and a few blacks sprang on deck before the sea closed over their heads. "The ship is sinking! The ship is sinking!" was the cry fore and aft. "Then a raft must be formed, my lads," sang out Lieutenant Hemming. "Never say die while life remains." End of Chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of The Three Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by TJP 1421. The Three Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 9. Wreck of the San Fernando. The heart of the bravest man may well sink within him when he hears the cry uttered, in accents of despair, "The ship is sinking! The ship is sinking!" Rogers and Adair looked at each other and thought that their last moments had really come. All the bright visions of the future which their young imaginations had conjured up vanished in a moment. Well might they, for the ship lay hopelessly on her side, with more than half her deck under water. There arose from every side shrieks and cries of terror. There were the distorted countenances of the blacks, as they crowded up the hatchway, through which the sea was pouring in torrents, while their own men, intent on preserving their lives to the last, were clambering up the bulwarks or working their way forward, which was the part of the ship the highest out of the water. Hemming, followed by the 2 midshipmen with axes in hand, endeavored to gain the same part of the ship. It was no easy task. The howling wind blew with terrific violence around them, and the seething ocean bubbled up and sent its fierce waves dashing over their heads. "Oh, save me!" cried Adair, as the sea struck him and washed him down the deck. But Hemming and Rogers caught the rope he had happily clutched and hauled him up again. At length they gained the forecastle, where most of their own crew had assembled, and some few of the fortunate blacks. They were the only survivors of the 400 or 500 human beings who lately breathed the breath of life on board. Mr. Hemming, looking round, saw that there was not a chance of the ship righting herself. He accordingly promptly issued orders for the formation of a raft. Such spars as were loose or could be got at were hauled up on the forecastle. The topgallant masts and royals had been carried away, and fortunately still floated near. Jack saw them and got them hauled in. Hemming, meantime, was wrenching up the forecastle deck to assist in the formation of a raft. There was not a moment to lose, for it was evident that the ship was fast settling down. Fortunately, a hammer and some nails were found forward. "Here, my lads," Lash the ends of these spars together, so as to form a square, cried Hemming, working energetically. That will do. Now this one diagonally. That will strengthen it. Now these planks. Nail them on as best we can on the top. That will do bravely. Next lash these lighter spars above all. They will form a coaming, and prevent us from slipping off the raft. Thus he went on, by his activity and cheerful voice, keeping up the spirits of his men and encouraging them to exertion. Mr. Hemming, cried Jack, how are we to live without food? I must try and get some. Who'll follow me? I will with all my heart, cried Dick Needham. Jack and he fastened ropes to their waists and dashed aft towards the chief cabin, which was already under water. The tornado had passed away as suddenly as it began, so that the water was tolerably smooth, or they could not have attempted this daring feat. I know where a cask of biscuits was stowed. If we can get it out, it will be a great thing, cried Jack, preparing to dive into the cabin. I saw some beef in one of the starboard lockers, said Needham, accompanying him. Another good swimmer and diver followed them. All three remained under water so long that those forward thought that they were lost. Adair could not restrain himself and was dashing aft, when Jack came to the surface, puffing and blowing like a grampus. He had discovered the cask of biscuits, but no beef was to be found. What, however, was of great consequence was a breaker of water which Needham found, and both were floated up to the raft forward. 2 other attempts were made to get provisions, but in vain. All the rest of the party were engaged with all their might in increasing and strengthening the raft. Then the cry arose, "She's going down! She's going down!" Jack looked about him as he came to the surface out of the submerged cabin, and seeing that not a moment was to be lost, summoning his 2 followers, sprang forward. Adair, with outstretched hand, was ready to help him onto the raft, as he felt the big ship sinking under his feet. Shove off, my lads!" sang out their commander. With spars and oars, the seamen forced the raft away from the foundering hull. Then, as the eddy formed by the huge mass going downwards through the water caught it, the helpless raft was hurled round and round, and then horrible seemed the fate in store for them. One side dipped into the sea, and all believed that it was going to be drawn down amid the vortex. The people held on tightly for their lives, tossing violently. However, up it again came to the surface, and floated evenly on the water. Still, their condition was melancholy in the extreme. On counting numbers, it was found that the 15 men who formed the prize crew, including officers, had escaped, with 2 Spaniards out of those who had been left on board to assist in working the ship, and 12 Negroes. To supply all these people with the food, there was only a cask of biscuits and about 12 gallons of water. How long they might have to remain exposed to scorching heat, fierce storms, or chilling fogs, it was impossible to say. Jack looked at Adair, and Adair looked at Jack, to read each other's feelings in their countenances. They felt for each other as brothers, and each trembled for the fate which might overtake his friend. "How far do you make it out we are from land?" asked Adair. "Oh, not more than 100 miles, answered Hemming. "That is nothing. The sea breeze would drive us there in the course of the day." He did not say this because he thought it. He wanted to keep up the spirits of the people under his charge. Nor did he remind them that they were 500 or 600 miles from Freetown, Sierra Leone, and a very considerable distance from Monrovia in Liberia. A 4-top-gallant studding sail had been hauled on board the raft, and this set on a spar served them as a sail. As soon as the ship had disappeared, and everything floating on her had been picked up, Hemming's first care was to arrange the people so as to trim the raft properly. He made them sit in rows back to back, with their faces to the sea. He, with Jack and Terence, sat in the center by the mast on the cask of biscuits and the water. A spar with the plank nailed to the outer end served as a rudder, and 2 very inefficient oars were manufactured in the same way. For some hours after the tornado they were becalmed, and then a light air from the southward sprang up, which enabled them to steer towards the land. After some consideration, Hemming stood up and addressed the men. Jack and Adair admired the calm and collected and indeed dignified way in which he spoke, so different from his manner when he was a mate.
"My men," he said, "we are placed by Providence in a very dangerous position. We must trust to the help of the Almighty, not to our own arm to save us. Still, we must exert ourselves to the best of our power to take care of our lives. We must husband our resources. We must behave with the utmost order. We must be kind to each other, and we must keep up our spirits and hope for the best. If we pray to God, he will hear us, and if he sees fit, he will save us. Now, my lads, let us pray."
On this the lieutenant offered up a sincere prayer for their preservation, and all who could understand him joined in it. Even the benighted blacks comprehended that he was performing some rite by which they were to benefit. After it, Hemming again got up.
"I told you, my lads, we must husband our resources. Till we see what progress we make, it will be wise to take only 1 biscuit a day. That will support life for some days, and if we take more, our stock will soon be exhausted."
The men replied cheerfully that they would limit themselves to any quantity he thought best. Poor fellows, they were to be sorely tried. The sun went down, and an easterly wind blew, and not only prevented them from approaching the coast, but again drove them slowly off it. When the sun rose, the wind fell altogether, and they lay exposed to the full fury of its scorching rays. A thirst, which the small quantity of water served out in a teacup during the day could in no way assuage, now attacked them. Jack and Adair felt their spirits sinking lower than they had ever gone before. They could scarcely eat their small allowance of biscuit. They knew, too, that in another day the bottom of the cask would be reached. Still, they tried to imitate Hemming in keeping up a cheerful countenance. Many of the people complained bitterly of their sufferings. The poor blacks said nothing, but 3 of them, almost at the same moment, sank back on the raft, and when those near them tried to lift them up, they were found to be dead. They were speedily lowered into the water. "Adair, what is that?" asked Jack, as a dark fin was seen gliding around the raft. "A shark," answered Adair. "See, there are 2, 3, 4 of them. We must have one of those fellows. They'll eat us if we don't eat them. That is very certain. Here, Needham, have a running bowline ready to slip over the head of the first one who comes near enough." The idea was taken up eagerly by the men. There being plenty of line on board, several of them sat ready with the bight of rope in hand, hoping to catch one of those evil-disposed monsters of the deep. But death in the meantime was busy among their companions. One by one the blacks dropped off, till one only remained. He was a fine-looking, intelligent young man, of great muscular strength and evidently superior to the rest in rank. He sat by himself, slowly eating crumb by crumb his share of biscuit, and gazing with steadfast eyes toward the land of his birth. Once more the wind got up, and sent the water washing over the frail raft, which worked fearfully as if it would come to pieces.
"Never fear, my lads," said Hemming. "I know of no part which will give way. It will hold together, depend on that."
In spite of all the working, it did hold together. Hemming's face, though his words were always cheering, looked very grave.
"Rogers, Adair, my friends," he said solemnly, "the water is expended, and there are no more biscuits. How shall I announce it to these poor fellows?"
He thought a little.
"Come now, lads," he cried. "Be smart about catching some fish. A change of food will do us all good."
No one asked for more biscuits or water. They knew it was all gone. Some gave way under the appalling thought. One of the Spaniards went raving mad and threw himself into the sea, whence no one had the strength to pull him out. The other fell back and died quietly. "Some of our men won't hold out much longer," observed Jack to Hemming. "Can we do nothing for them?"
"Nothing,"
answered Hemming solemnly. The cool air of the night seemed to revive them, but when the hot sun came out and shone down on their unprotected heads, they died. 2 more went raving mad. They chattered and sang, and then howled and shrieked. It was with difficulty they could be held down. One of them escaped from his companions and threw himself into the sea. The other was prevented from following his example, but his strength gradually decreased till he also died. Scarcely was his body sent into the deep than a fair wind sprang up, and the sail being hoisted, the raft went along at the rate of 3 or 4 miles an hour. No one had relaxed their efforts to catch a shark. A shout was given, not a loud one, for their voices were already hollow and weak, and several men were seen hauling in the head and shoulders of a large shark. How eager and anxious was the expression of their countenances, for they all dreaded lest their prize should escape them. Their strength, too, was scarcely adequate to the task. At last he was hauled up on the raft, but so violent were his struggles that he nearly threw some of the people into the sea as they crawled up towards him to dispatch him with their axes. At last Jack, not knowing what mischief might be committed, sprang towards him, and aiming a blow at his tail, struck directly on it, and instantly he was quieted. Scarcely was the monster dead than the men's knives were cutting away at him. Some drank his blood, and others eagerly ate the yet almost quivering flesh. The officers, however ravenous they felt, got some thin slices, which they dried in the sun before eating. Food had thus been providentially sent to them, but their sufferings from thirst soon became very painful. It was piteous to hear some of the poor fellows crying out for water when there was none to give them. Several more died from the grievous thirst they were suffering. Mr. Hemming anxiously looked around the horizon. Not a sail was in sight in any direction. Hour after hour passed away. Their tongues became parched and clove to the roof of their mouths.
"This is dreadful," whispered Jack. "I don't think I can stand it much longer."
"I would give a guinea for a bottle of ginger beer," exclaimed Terence.
"Oh, how delicious!
"Don't talk of such a thing. I would give 10 for a pint of the dirtiest ditch water in which a duck ever waddled," said Jack.
"However, we must try and not think about it."
Some hours passed slowly by after this, when Hemming's eye was seen to brighten up.
"Is there a sail in sight?"
asked Jack and Adair, who were constantly watching his looks.
"No," he answered, "but there is a cloud on the horizon. It is a small one, but it rises slowly in the northwest, and trust betokens rain. If it does not bring wind at the same time, our sufferings might be relieved."
How anxious all on the raft who had yet consciousness left watched the progress of that little cloud, at first not bigger than a man's hand. How their hearts sank within them when they thought that it had stopped, or that its course was altered. But it had not stopped, though it advanced but slowly. Still it grew, and extended wider and wider on either hand, and grew darker and darker till it formed a black canopy over their heads, and then there was a pattering, hissing noise heard over the calm sea, and down came the rain in large drops, thick and fast. The men lifted up their grateful faces to the heaven to catch the refreshing liquid in their mouths as it fell. But Hemming lowered the sail, and, ordering the men to stretch it wide, caught the rain in it, and let it run off into the breaker till it was full. Then they filled the cask which had held the biscuits, and each man took off his shirt, and let it get wet through and through, and eagerly they sucked the sail, so that not a drop more than could be helped of the precious fluid should be lost. Then, when they found that the rain continued, each man took a draught of the pure water from the cask, which they again filled up as before by means of the sail. "Oh, Terence, how delicious!" exclaimed Jack, drawing a deep breath. "Nectar," said Adair, draining a last drop in his cup. It was a doubtful brown hue, and in reality tepid from falling on not over clean and hot sail. Jack and Terence learned the lesson that the value of things can only be ascertained by being compared with others. That shower was the means sent by Providence to preserve the lives of many of those on the raft. Some were already too far gone to benefit by it. They opened their glassy eyes and allowed their shipmates to pour the water down their parched throats. They seemed to revive for a short time, but soon again sank. Some even died while the water was trickling over their cracked lips. All this time the raft was constantly surrounded by sharks. The flesh of the first caught was almost exhausted, and though dried in the sun, had become rather savory.
"Come, my lads, we must have another of those fellows," cried Hemming, standing up and supporting himself against the mast. "Can any of you heave the bight of a rope over one of them?"
"I'll try, sir," said Dick Needham, kneeling at the edge of the raft, for he had not strength to stand. How changed he was from the stout seaman he had appeared but a few days before. He had made several trials in vain. Jack Shark always kept at too great a distance when the rope was thrown. At last one of the seamen took off his shoes, and tucking his trousers, stuck out his leg and moved it slowly backwards and forwards. The voracious shark saw that tempting bait and made a dash at it. The seaman drew it in, and as the fish, disappointed of his prize, turned round, whisking up his tail out of the water, Needham adroitly hove the rope over it. As the shark darted off, Dick was very nearly drawn overboard. But the rope tightening brought up the shark, and as he turned round to ascertain what had got hold of his tail, another rope was thrown over his head, and he was hauled, in spite of his plunges and struggles, on board. A few blows on the spine near the tail quickly finished him. He was soon cut up, some part of him was eaten fresh, and the rest was hung up to dry. The men would have thrown what they did not want overboard, but their commander reminded them that bad weather might come on when they could not catch another, and that they should preserve a store for such an event. It was fortunate this forethought was shown, for that very night a strong breeze sprang up, and the frail raft was tossed up and down till there appeared every chance of its upsetting or being knocked to pieces. Happily, more rain came down and refreshed them, and the clouds sheltered them from the scorching rays of the sun, or not one of them would have held out. Sadly were their numbers reduced. 10 Englishmen and the young African chief only now remained alive. Some of them appeared almost at death's door, and they would have slipped from the raft had not their comrades held them on. Darkness again came down on the waters, and the wave-tossed raft drove onwards, no one knew in what direction. The stars were hidden. They had no compass, nor, had they possessed one, was there a lantern by which to see it. Great were the horrors of that night and of the 2 succeeding nights. Still, neither did the gallant Hemming nor his 2 younger companions allow their courage to desert them. They conversed as much as they could. They talked of their past lives. They even spoke of the future, nor did they forget to pray to heaven for strength to support whatever might yet be in store for them. Still the wet and cold of the night and the heat of the day was telling fearfully on all of them.
"When do you think we'll reach the shore, sir?" asked Jack. "We've been driving for a long time towards it nicely." "In 2 days, if the wind holds," answered Hemming. "Perhaps in less time we might see it."
But the wind did not hold. Once more they knew that they were being blown off it. Their hearts sank. They well nigh gave way to despair. Each of the officers took in turns to stand up to keep a lookout for a sail or for land. Jack was standing on top of the cask, holding on by the mast, when his eye fell on a white, glittering object to the north.
"Yes, it is," he exclaimed. "A sail! A sail! She must be standing in this way."
All but the weakest or most desponding turned their anxious eye in the direction Jack indicated. The sight of some was already too dim to discern her, but others raised a feeble shout, and declared that she was standing close hauled towards them. How eagerly they watched her, till their anxiety became painful in the extreme. Some shouted, "We shall be saved! We shall be saved!" But others moaned out, "No, no, she'll not see us. She'll pass us." Hemming stood up, watching the approaching vessel. He said nothing. He was not certain that she would near them. 1 hour of intense anxiety passed. There was very little wind. Another hour glided on.
"Yes, my lads, she is undoubtedly standing this way," cried Hemming. "But—" and he stopped. "She may be a slaver, and if so, I know not whether we shall be better off than we are now." "Surely bad as they may be, they would not leave us," said Jack. "Don't let us be too sure of that. There's nothing too bad for slavers to do," observed Hemming. "However, let us hope for the best." The stranger approached. She had very square yards, very white canvas, and a black hull. If she was not a slaver, she looked very like one. Still, even if they had wished it, they could not have avoided her. On she came. Her course would have taken her somewhat wide of the raft. It was not seen, apparently. Then suddenly her course was altered. Someone on board had made them out. The brig stood towards them. When she was scarcely more than half a mile off, it fell a dead calm. A boat was lowered. "Those fellows pull in a man-of-war style," observed Hemming. "Grant she may be an English cruiser, but I fear not." The almost dying seamen endeavoured to cheer her, but their weak voices were scarcely heard over the waters. The boat dashed towards them. They could hear the officer in her speaking to his men. It was in Spanish. "Then they are slavers, after all," cried Jack with a sigh. He had taken a great antipathy to slavers. To an Englishman, no class of men are more hateful. The boat came alongside. The people in her regarded them with looks of commiseration. Well, they might have done so, for more wretched-looking beings could scarcely have been seen. Two of them stepped on board the raft, to which they secured a rope, and began towing it towards the brig. Neither Hemming nor any of his companions could speak Spanish, so they asked no questions. They were soon alongside the brig, and were handed up on deck. They felt sure that they were going on board a slaver, or perhaps a pirate. But what was their surprise to see several officers in uniform on deck, one of whom stepped forward and addressed them in very good English. "You are on board Her Most Catholic Majesty's brig, the San Fernando. We will not ask you how you came into this plight. You shall be taken below, and all possible care shall be bestowed on you." Hemming tried in vain to reply to this very kind and polite speech. He pointed to his mouth and signified that he could not speak. The necessity for exertion being over, he felt himself completely unnerved. The officers were conveyed to the captain's cabin, the men to a sick bay on deck, and the surgeon, if not very clever, was kind, and what they chiefly wanted was rest and food. Jack and Terence fell asleep, and slept 24 hours without waking, so they said. Several days passed, however, before they were able to sit up in their beds. At last they were able to crawl up on deck. It was wonderful then how soon they picked up their strength. Hemming took longer to come round. Dick Needham was about as soon as they were. 2 poor fellows died on board, so that 8 only of the prize crew ultimately remained alive. The brig, they found, had come out nominally in search of pirates, and was then bound across to Cuba. The captain was a very gentlemanly man. So were some of the officers, especially the first lieutenant, who spoke English well. One of the sub-lieutenants, or mates, also spoke a little English, so they got on capitally. The captain said he would not go back to Sierra Leone, but would land them at Fernando Po. The brig, they found, had touched, while they were in bed, at several places along the coast, and what with light winds and baffling winds, her progress was much delayed. "I wonder, Paddy, when shall we ever get on shore again?" said Jack. "I should like to get back to the frigate, to let them know that we are not all lost, for I'm afraid that they'll be writing home not to expect to see us again, and all that sort of thing, and then all our families will be going into mourning for us." "I'm afraid mine would find it a hard matter just now to pay for the said black garments," said Adair. "They're in a bad way just as to money matters when I left home. The famine and the fever killed the people, and the rent did not come in, and to say the truth, I don't know that any of them will trouble their heads much about me." "Oh, don't say that, Paddy," exclaimed Jack. "Still, I don't know. Sometimes I've wished that the dear ones at home would not be so unhappy when they hear that we are lost. And then again, I should be very sorry if they did not love me. I own, I only hope that they may not hear of the loss of the prize." When they were able to observe the state of things on board, they discovered that the brig was in a very bad state of discipline. The crew were a worthless set of vagabonds,
the scum of some Spanish port, pirates, slavers, and cutthroats of all descriptions. The officers tried to get obeyed, but could not, and at last seemed to give it up as a bad job. Some of them, indeed, were very little better than the men. The brig consequently was constantly getting into irons or being taken aback by careless steering, and it was only wonderful that she had got thus far on her voyage without a serious accident. The captain and first lieutenant, though pleasing in their manners, were evidently not much of seamen, and took their observations in a very careless way. Hemming, on questioning them, found that they had not been to sea for a long time, and had they not been compelled, would not have come now. They seemed fully aware that things were not as they should be, but they shrugged their shoulders, and said that they could not help it. By this time Hemming, as well as the rest of the people, with the exception of two poor fellows, had almost recovered their strength. The weather had hitherto been fine, but it came on very thick one night, and began to blow hard. But the wind was fair, and the captain, who was in a hurry to get over his voyage, continued to carry on a press of sail. Lieutenant Hemming and the two midshipmen, who did not like the look of things, with the rest of the English, continued on deck.
"Are you certain that you know your exact position?" asked Hemming of the first lieutenant. He was not indignant, but he laughed and said that the master was a good navigator, and that he must be right. Hemming had formed a different opinion. An hour passed. Suddenly Jack and Adair, who were walking together, were startled by a cry from the lookout forward, which they guessed was, as it proved, "Breakers ahead!" They with Hemming ran forward to ascertain the state of things, and there they made out through the darkness on the port bow a mass of white breakers. No sooner did Hemming see them than he rushed aft to put the helm to port, while the officers on deck were giving different orders. When he got to the wheel, he found that it had been put the wrong way, while the yards were being braced up first in one direction, then in another. The next instant the brig struck with a tremendous crash, throwing those on deck off their legs, and those below out of their berths. The following sea lifted the brig nearly her entire length more ahead, jamming her between two rocks, and a third came rushing on board and made a clean sweep of everything on her decks. Jack and Adair and Needham were together. "There are those two poor fellows below, sir. Don't let us forget them," said the latter. "Certainly not," exclaimed Jack and Adair together. They dived below and brought them up, and then followed Hemming and the rest of their shipmates into the main rigging. The authority of the Spanish officers was now completely gone. Not an order was obeyed. Indeed, every man seemed to be aware that he must look out for himself, and that there was no one on whom he could depend. The first sea which came on board washed away several unfortunate wretches. Their shrieks and cries for help were heard as they were dashed against the rocks, no one being able to render them the slightest assistance. The greater part of the crew began to collect in the rigging and the tops, and there they seemed to prepare themselves to spend the night. Indeed, dark as it was, it would have been difficult, even with strict discipline, for them to have concerted effectual measures to save themselves. The gale increased, and with it occasionally bright flashes of lightning darted from the black clouds. By their light, as they went zigzagging around them, Jack, whose eyes were the sharpest, thought he discerned close to them a rock, towards which he resolved, should the vessel go to pieces, to endeavour to make his way. He pointed it out to his companions. "Stick by me, Paddy, you know, as I am a good swimmer. I may be able to lend you a hand," he sang out to his messmate, who knew full well that he could trust to his help. Terrific indeed was that night. Few of those who long to follow a sea life, if they could see pictured out before them all the sufferings and hardships they may be called on to endure, would not hesitate before adopting it. The roar of the waves as they dashed over the rocks, the howling of the wind in the rigging, the groaning of the hull at each successive blow she received from the seas, mingled with the cries and shrieks of those who had remained on deck, or who had fallen from the rigging and been washed overboard, together with the oaths and blasphemies of many of the survivors, mingled in one chaotic and terrific uproar, which stunned and bewildered the senses. Some hours thus passed. At last Hemming's voice was heard calling them quickly out of the rigging. Without hesitation they obeyed him.
The brig had heeled over on her side, and her decks were exposed to the full fury of the sea. Scarcely had Jack and Terence descended than the mainmast with a crash went by the board, throwing off many who clung to it and crushing others.
"Follow me, my lads! We'll try to get on the rock close aboard us,"
shouted Hemming, as he began to clamber off uncovered by the seas, which roared up over the ship, along the unstable mass, the extreme end of which just touched the wave-washed rock. "Come along, Paddy! Come along!" cried Jack, as they also endeavoured to work their way in the direction taken by their commander. End of chapter 9. Recording by TJP 1421.